Late autumn 1991, New York City. A private gathering at a loft in Soho, the kind of place where exposed brick walls held decades of artistic rebellion and cigarette smoke had permanently stained the ceiling tiles a shade of amber. The apartment belonged to a music producer who had worked with everyone from Lou Reed to Patti Smith, and who hosted these informal salons whenever enough interesting people happened to be in town at the same time. Maybe 40 people that night. Musicians, poets, a few painters, some record executives trying to seem cultured, journalists who knew better than to write about what they witnessed at these gatherings. The unwritten rule was simple. What happened in these rooms stayed in these rooms. That's why artists actually showed up. That's why they actually talked. Bob Dylan was holding court near the window, a glass of red wine in his hand, telling stories about the Greenwich Village days to a small circle of admirers. He was 50 years old, a living monument to American songwriting, the man who had redefined what lyrics could be. His words had soundtracked revolutions, broken hearts, and confused English professors for 3 decades. When Dylan spoke about songwriting, people listened. They took mental notes. They quoted him for years afterward. Across the room, sitting alone on a worn leather couch, was a 24-year-old with stringy blonde hair and a cardigan that looked like it had been found in a thrift store dumpster. Kurt Cobain had released Nevermind exactly 2 months earlier. The album was climbing the charts in a way that nobody, least of all Kurt himself, had anticipated. Smells Like Teen Spirit was on every radio station, every MTV rotation. Nirvana was being called the voice of a generation, a title Kurt found both absurd and suffocating. He hadn't wanted to come tonight. His manager had insisted. "You need to network," Danny had said. "You need to be seen with the right people." Kurt hated networking, hated being seen, hated the entire machinery of fame that was starting to grind him between its gears. But he'd come anyway, hoping to find a quiet corner where he could observe without being observed. That plan failed the moment someone recognized him. "That's Kurt Cobain," a voice whispered. "From Nirvana." Heads turned. The whisper spread. Within minutes, Kurt became aware that people were watching him, studying him, trying to figure out if he was really as tortured as his music suggested, or if it was all an act. He pulled his cardigan tighter and stared at the floor. Dylan noticed the commotion. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize when someone new was pulling focus. He asked the producer who the kid on the couch was. "Kurt Cobain, Nirvana. They're huge right now." "Never heard of them," Dylan said. Though this wasn't entirely true. He'd heard Teen Spirit on the radio. Hadn't been impressed. Too loud, too messy, too obvious. The lyrics were repetitive, almost childish in their simplicity. He couldn't understand why the kids were going crazy for it. "You should talk to him," the producers suggested. "He's supposedly a fan of yours." Dylan considered this. He'd met plenty of young musicians who claimed to be fans, who wanted his blessing, who hoped some of his credibility would rub off on them. Most of them were forgettable, but there was something in the way this kid sat alone, disconnected from the party around him, that sparked Dylan's curiosity. He walked over. "Mind if I sit?" Kurt looked up, and for a moment his eyes widened. Bob Dylan, standing right there, asking permission to sit next to him. Kurt had grown up listening to Dylan's records. Blonde on Blonde had been a revelation during his teenage years in Aberdeen. He'd spent hours trying to decode the imagery, the wordplay, the layers of meaning that seemed to multiply with every listen. "Sure," Kurt said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dylan sat down, studied the young man for a moment. Up close, Kurt looked even younger than his years. Pale skin, dark circles under his eyes, a nervous energy that manifested in the way his fingers kept picking at a loose thread on his cardigan. "You're the Nirvana kid," Dylan said. Not a question. "Yeah. I heard your song on the radio. The one everyone's playing." Kurt waited. He could tell from Dylan's tone that a critique was coming. He'd heard enough critiques by now to recognize the setup. "It's catchy," Dylan said. "Gets stuck in your head. But I couldn't understand a word you were singing. What's it about?" Kurt shrugged. "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "You wrote the song and you don't know what it's about." "I know what it feels like. I don't know what it means." This answer seemed to irritate Dylan. He'd spent his career crafting lyrics with intention, with purpose, with layers of meaning that academics could spend careers unpacking. The idea of writing a song without knowing what it meant struck him as lazy, as amateurish. "Young man," Dylan said, leaning forward slightly, "if you want to be taken seriously as a songwriter, you need to learn to write real lyrics, not just sounds, not just feelings, words that mean something, words that last." The room had gone quiet. People nearby had noticed Dylan talking to the kid from Nirvana, and they'd stopped their own conversations to listen. This was exactly the kind of moment these gatherings were famous for. A legend confronting a newcomer. Wisdom being passed down or rejected. Kurt didn't respond immediately. He stared at his hands, at the chipped black nail polish he hadn't bothered to remove. His face revealed nothing. "Real lyrics," Kurt repeated. "Like yours." "Like mine, yes. Like Leonard Cohen. Like Joni Mitchell. Writers who actually have something to say and know how to say it. Poetry, craft, not just screaming over distortion." Still, Kurt said nothing. The silence stretched. People exchanged glances. Was the kid intimidated? Angry? Simply too stoned to respond? Then Kurt looked up. His blue eyes, which had seemed unfocused before, were suddenly sharp. "Can I tell you something?" Kurt asked. Dylan made a gesture that said, "Go ahead." "When I was 16, Kurt began, his voice low and steady, "I lived under a bridge, not metaphorically, actually under a bridge, in Aberdeen, Washington, sleeping on cardboard, eating out of dumpsters. It was winter. It rained every day." The room was completely silent now. Everyone was listening. "I wrote a song about it years later. Didn't try to make it poetic. Didn't try to make it mean anything more than what it was. Just tried to remember what it felt like. The cold, the concrete, the way nobody looked at you because looking at you would mean acknowledging you existed." Kurt paused. His fingers had stopped picking at the loose thread. "The song is called Something in the Way. Do you want to hear some of it?" Dylan nodded, though something had shifted in his expression, a hint of uncertainty, maybe curiosity. Kurt didn't sing. He spoke the words, almost whispered them, in a voice so quiet that people had to lean in to hear. He recited a few fragments, not the whole song, just pieces, about living underneath a bridge, about the tarp above keeping him dry, about dripping water and animals that had become friends. Simple words. Plain images. No metaphors, no symbolism. Just the cold, hard truth of a memory. When he finished, he looked at Dylan. Waiting. Dylan sat very still. The wine glass in his hand had stopped moving. Around them, the party had essentially frozen. Everyone had heard Kurt speak those words, and everyone was trying to process what they just witnessed. It wasn't poetry in the traditional sense. There were no elaborate metaphors, no biblical references, no layers of meaning to unpack. It was simply a statement of fact, a memory rendered in the plainest possible language. And yet it hit harder than poetry, harder than craft. There was something in the nakedness of it, the refusal to dress up pain in pretty words, that bypassed the intellect entirely and went straight to the heart. Dylan understood this. He'd spent 40 years learning every trick of the trade, every technique for manipulating words into shapes that could move people. And this kid had just moved an entire room with 8 lines that a child could have written, because it wasn't about the words themselves, it was about what was behind them. The truth, the lived experience, the refusal to perform suffering instead of simply stating it. "Where did you live after the bridge?" Dylan finally asked. "Different places, friends' couches, sometimes my car, sometimes nowhere." "How old were you?" 16, 17, somewhere in there." Dylan nodded slowly. He set his wine glass down on the coffee table, carefully, deliberately, as if he needed a moment to collect himself. Dylan understood this. He'd spent 40 years learning every trick of the trade, every technique for manipulating words into shapes that could move people. And this kid had just moved an entire room with 8 lines that a child could have written, because it wasn't about the words themselves, it was about what was behind them, the truth, the lived experience, the refusal to perform suffering instead of simply stating it. "Where did you live after the bridge?" Dylan finally asked. "Different places, friends' couches, sometimes my car, sometimes nowhere. How old were you? 16, 17, somewhere in there. Dylan nodded slowly. He set his wine glass down on the coffee table, carefully, deliberately, as if he needed a moment to collect himself. I've never lived under a bridge, Dylan said quietly. I've written about suffering. I've imagined it, documented it, tried to give voice to people who couldn't speak for themselves, but I've never lived under a bridge. Kurt said nothing. He wasn't accusing Dylan of anything. He wasn't trying to claim moral superiority. He was just stating facts. Maybe that's the difference, Dylan continued, almost talking to himself now. I learned to write about pain. You learn to survive it. The conversation shifted after that. Other people drifted over, hoping to join the conversation, but something about the energy between the two men kept them at a distance. This was a private moment, even in a crowded room. At one point, Dylan asked Kurt about his writing process. I don't really have one, Kurt said. Words come. Sometimes they fit the music. Sometimes they don't. I don't worry about making sense. I worry about making it feel true. Feel true, Dylan repeated. Yeah. A lot of songs make sense, but they don't feel like anything. I'd rather write something that doesn't make sense but feels like everything. Dylan considered this. It went against everything he'd been taught, everything he'd taught others, about the craft of songwriting. And yet he couldn't argue with the results. Whatever Kurt was doing, it was connecting with people in a way that Dylan's recent work hadn't. Not that Dylan would admit this out loud, not that night, maybe not ever, but he felt it. The world was changing. The rules he'd helped write were being rewritten by kids who'd never asked for permission. You remind me of someone, Dylan said after a long pause. Who? Me, 30 years ago, before I knew what I was doing, when I was just trying to tell the truth and hoping someone would listen. Kurt looked surprised by this. He hadn't expected Dylan to make any comparison between them. If anything, he'd expected Dylan to dismiss him entirely after the real lyrics comment. I don't think I'm anything like you, Kurt said. Maybe not. Maybe that's the point. Maybe every generation needs someone who sounds nothing like the generation before. Someone who makes the old guard uncomfortable. You're uncomfortable? Dylan almost smiled. Let's say you've given me something to think about. The party continued around them. Eventually, Dylan was pulled away by someone who wanted to introduce him to someone else, and Kurt was left alone on the couch again. But something had changed. The tension in his shoulders had eased slightly. For a few minutes, he'd been seen, really seen, by someone whose opinion actually mattered to him. He didn't stay much longer. He slipped out around midnight, without saying goodbye to anyone. In the weeks that followed, Dylan found himself thinking about that conversation more than he'd expected. He listened to Nevermind, actually listened to it, with headphones in his studio. He still didn't like all of it. The loudness still bothered him, but something in the way stopped him cold. It was the last track on the album, just Kurt's voice and a guitar, almost whispered, painfully intimate. The words were exactly as Kurt had spoken them at the party. Simple, direct, devastating. Dylan played it 3 times in a row. Then he sat in silence for a long time. He'd been wrong. Not about craft. He still believed in craft, still believed in the importance of working on your words until they were exactly right. But he'd been wrong to assume that craft was the only path to truth. Kurt had found another way, a way that depended not on what you added to the words, but on what you stripped away. Years later, in an interview that surfaced in a documentary about songwriting, Dylan was asked about influences on his later work. He mentioned several names. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "There was this kid I met once, at a party in New York. He told me about living under a bridge when he was a teenager. Just told it straight, no poetry, no metaphors. And it hit me harder than any song I'd heard in years. Made me think about what lyrics really need to be. Sometimes they need to be less." The interviewer asked who the kid was. "Kurt Cobain," Dylan said. "He died young, too young. But he taught me something that night. You can spend your whole life learning to be clever with words, and then someone comes along who doesn't know any of the rules and says something so simple, it makes all your cleverness feel like showing off." What did you learn from him? Dylan paused for a long moment. That the truth doesn't need decoration, that pain doesn't need metaphors, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do as a writer is just say what happened and trust that it's enough. April 1994. Kurt Cobain was found dead in Seattle. He was 27 years old. Dylan was on tour when he heard. His manager called with the news, and Dylan sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without saying anything. That night, during his concert, Dylan didn't mention Kurt's death, but he changed his set list at the last minute. He played a stripped-down acoustic set instead of the electric show he'd planned. Just him and his guitar. Plain words, simple melodies. In the years that followed, Dylan's songwriting began to change. Critics noticed a new simplicity in some of his lyrics, a willingness to state things plainly that hadn't been there before. Not all the time. He was still Dylan. He still loved wordplay and symbolism and layers of meaning. But every now and then, a song would appear that was stripped down to the bone. Just the truth, told straight. Nobody knew for certain where that influence came from. Dylan never said, but the people who'd been at that party in Soho in 1991 had their theories. They remembered the way Dylan had listened to Kurt speak those words. They remembered the silence that followed. They remembered the look on Dylan's face when he realized he'd been taught something by a kid in a thrift store cardigan who'd lived under a bridge. Bob Dylan, the master of words, had been rendered speechless by someone who'd learned to say less. And in that silence, something passed between them. Not a torch being passed, not wisdom being transferred, just recognition. One truth teller acknowledging another. Different generations, different sounds, different ways of being broken by the world, but the same fundamental mission, to take the unspeakable and speak it anyway. The night Bob Dylan told Kurt Cobain to learn to write real lyrics, he expected the young man to be humbled, to ask for guidance, to recognize the distance between amateur noise and serious art. Instead, Kurt spoke 8 lines about a bridge and made Dylan question everything he thought he knew about what lyrics could be. Kurt never found out that his words stayed with Dylan. Never knew that the conversation changed how a legend thought about his own craft. He died 3 years later, still believing he had nothing valuable to teach anyone. But he did. He taught Bob Dylan that sometimes the shortest distance between two hearts is a sentence with no metaphors at all. And Dylan, to his credit, listened, even if it took him years to admit it, even if he never got the chance to say thank you. The story of that night became a quiet legend among those who were there. Not the kind of legend that gets written up in magazines or documented in biographies. The kind that gets whispered between musicians in backstage corridors and hotel bars. A reminder that genius doesn't always look like what you expect. That the old masters don't always stay masters. That sometimes a kid from Aberdeen with nothing but pain and honesty can walk into a room full of legends and teach them something they'll never forget. Kurt Cobain didn't try to impress Bob Dylan that night. He just told the truth. And somehow, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.